Have you ever watched your world be deleted in real time? Imagine your legacy stolen, your dignity mocked, and your only support sitting in a wheelchair while your billionaire husband laughs in your face. That was Maya Sterling's reality. Her husband, Julian, thought he'd successfully debugged her from his life, telling the court she was too broken to even deserve her own daughter. But Julian made a fatal calculation error. He forgot to check the fine print on Maya's past. You're about to witness a courtroom demolition that didn't just break a marriage, it dismantled a dynasty. This is a story of a man who thought money made him a god, and the mother's fury that proved him mortal. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button for more tales of ultimate justice. Before we dive right in, quickly hit that subscribe button right now and join the Storyverse community. Whether you're watching from the skyscrapers of Manhattan, USA, the heart of London, UK, or anywhere across Australia, Canada, and Europe, drop a comment below. I want to see just how far this story of justice and a mother's fury can reach. Now, let's dive right back into the courtroom. The air in the Manhattan federal court was sterile, tasting of ozone and $5,000 suits. Julian Sterling leaned back, checking his diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe with the impatience of a man who already owned the verdict. Beside him was his vulture lead counsel, a man hired to turn a wife into a liability. She has no money, no legal team, and no legs to stand on, the lawyer whispered, his voice smooth as venom. Across the aisle, Maya sat alone. In her simple black dress, she looked like a fragile shadow against the cold marble. No assistants, no files, just a mother fighting for her child. Julian smirked, loud enough for the gallery to hear, "Look at her. A brilliant architect reduced to a malfunctioning piece of furniture. It's almost a mercy to end this now." Julian Sterling didn't just want a divorce, he wanted a total deletion. He sat at the plaintiff's table, leaning back with a nonchalant grace that suggested he was watching a polo match rather than the dismantling of a human life. Beside him, his lead counsel, a shark-eyed man named Pierce Thorne, rose slowly, adjusting his silk lapels before turning to the judge. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice dripping with practiced empathy, "it is a tragedy when a family is struck by misfortune, but we must separate sentiment from the cold, hard reality of child safety." On the massive high-definition screens lining the courtroom walls, a series of images flickered to life. These weren't photos of a happy family, they were surveillance clips Julian had secretly recorded in their penthouse. The court watched in silence as Maya, struggling to transfer herself from her wheelchair to the nursery glider, nearly dropped a stuffed animal. Another clip showed her in the kitchen, her arms straining and failing to reach a high shelf where their daughter's fever medication was kept. It was a curated gallery of failure, a calculated attempt to turn Maya's physical limitations into a moral indictment of her fitness as a mother. "Look at the data, not the emotion," Thorne continued, pacing the length of the mahogany floor like a predator. "Mrs. Sterling was a world-class architect, yes. But the woman before you today is a ghost of that person. She cannot run after a toddler who wanders toward a pool. She cannot navigate a fire emergency. To grant her custody is to leave a defenseless child in the care of someone who is, by her own medical definition, a liability." Maya felt every eye in the gallery burning into the back of her neck. She looked down at her hands, which were trembling despite her desperate efforts to keep them still. Julian caught her gaze and offered a thin, serpentine smile, the look of a man who had set a trap so perfect that even the truth couldn't find its way out. "It's for the best, Maya," he mouthed, his eyes glinting with predatory satisfaction. "You can't even hold yourself up. How can you expect to hold a family together?" Thorne then presented the final piece of the billionaire's trap, a psychological evaluation from a top-tier Dr. Julian had quietly put on his payroll. The report claimed Maya suffered from chronic cognitive fatigue and post-traumatic instability, suggesting she was not just physically paralyzed, but mentally unfit. The room felt smaller, the air colder. Maya was being erased in the very city she had helped design, stripped of her motherhood by a man who saw her as nothing more than a malfunctioning asset he was ready to write off. The trap was shut, the bolts were sliding into place, and as the judge leaned forward with a look of growing pity, Maya felt the last of her hope beginning to wither. The courtroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence, but the loudest sound in the room was the lack of an objection. Maya turned to her lead attorney, Marcus Henderson, her eyes pleading for him to stand, to shout, to tear Julian's doctored surveillance footage to shreds. Instead, Henderson sat motionless, his fingers tracing the edge of a sleek, leather-bound folder. He didn't look like a man preparing for a counteroffensive. He looked like a man waiting for a clock to run out. "Marcus," Maya hissed, her voice a fragile thread of desperation. "The medication logs. You have the logs showing Julian was overprescribing those sedatives. Use them. Tell the judge I wasn't unfit, I was drugged." Henderson didn't turn his head. He merely leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive peppermint and cowardice. "Maya, we talked about this. Bringing up the meds makes you look paranoid. It plays right into their hands. We need to be realistic about your limitations." As he spoke, he checked his watch, a brand new, rose gold timepiece that caught the light with a clinical glint. Maya's heart plummeted. It was a rare, limited edition model she had seen in Julian's private luxury catalog just weeks before the accident. The realization hit her like a physical blow, more paralyzing than the injury to her spine. She looked across the aisle and saw Julian's attorney, Thorne, give a microscopic, knowing nod to Henderson. It wasn't a nod of professional respect. It was the silent acknowledgement of a transaction completed. The silence of Maya wasn't a legal strategy, it was a paid performance. Julian hadn't just frozen her bank accounts. He had reached across the aisle and bought her voice. Every forgotten file, every missed deposition, and every piece of evidence Henderson had advised her to save for later flashed through her mind as a sequence of deliberate sabotage. She wasn't sitting behind a defense table. She was sitting in a secondary witness box, guarded by a man who had already sold her future to her husband. As Henderson leaned back and whispered about the wisdom of a quick surrender, Maya realized that the trial wasn't just rigged, it was a public execution. In this room of mahogany and law, surrounded by people who saw her only as a broken liability, she was completely and utterly alone. The judge's gavel hovered in the air, a final stroke of mahogany meant to seal Maya's fate and finalize the erasure of her life. But before the wood could meet the bench, the double doors at the rear of courtroom 502 didn't just open. They were thrown back with a sudden, violent force that echoed like a thunderclap through the sterile hall. The sound was so absolute that every head in the room, the cynical journalists, the bored bailiffs, and Julian himself, snapped toward the entrance. A woman stood on the threshold, framed by the bright, harsh light of the corridor. She didn't scurry in, nor did she wait for permission. She moved into the room with a measured, predatory grace that commanded the air around her. Her suit was a masterclass in silent authority, a charcoal gray wool so fine it looked like liquid stone, tailored with sharp, surgical precision. She wore no flashy jewelry, only a small, silver pin on her lapel that those in the highest echelons of Washington would recognize instantly. It was the mark of a woman who didn't just understand the law. She had spent decades shaping it. As she marched down the center aisle, the clicking of her heels against the marble floor sounded like a rhythmic death knell. Julian's smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated. His face, once flushed with the arrogance of a billionaire who had bought the world, turned a sickly, translucent gray. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned white, his eyes bulging as if he were seeing a ghost. Maya looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The woman reaching the bar wasn't the broken, destitute figure Julian had described in his depositions. This was Elena Vance, the ghost of the Justice Department, the woman who had argued before the Supreme Court while Julian was still learning how to cook the books of his first startup.
I approach with the weight of truth.
Ma'am.
Your story will be heard.
Who is this? The judge demanded, though his voice lacked its previous edge of irritation, replaced by a reflexive, professional caution. Elena stopped at the defense table, her gaze never leaving Julian's terrified face. She didn't look at Maya yet. She was too busy pinning her prey to his seat with a look of cold, incandescent fury. She dropped a heavy, leather-bound briefcase onto the table, the sound heavy with the weight of impending doom. "My name is Elena Vance," she said, her voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. "And I am appearing as lead counsel for Maya Sterling. But before we discuss this divorce, Your Honor, I'd like to present a federal warrant for the immediate seizure of Julian Sterling's private servers." The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, the power in the room shifted so violently that the air seemed to thin. Julian wasn't the hunter anymore. He was a man realizing he had just invited a hurricane into his house. Elena finally turned to Maya, a flash of steel-hard protection in her eyes, and whispered, "I'm here now, Maya. And I'm taking it all back." "Your Honor, if I may," Julian's lead attorney, Thorne, stammered, his voice lacking its previous predatory edge. "Ms. Vance is not a member of this bar. She's a ghost. She's been out of the country for decades. This is a highly irregular interruption of a private civil matter." Elena didn't even look at him. She reached into her charcoal gray jacket and produced a slim, gold-embossed identification card, sliding it across the bench toward the judge. "I am a member of the Supreme Court Bar, and as of 6 hours ago, I have been reinstated as special counsel by the Department of Justice. But you might remember me better from the years I spent as the Solicitor General of the United States." The judge adjusted his glasses, leaning in to inspect the credentials. His expression shifted from professional irritation to a profound, respectful shock. The courtroom, usually a place of dry procedural talk, felt like it was suddenly standing on the edge of a precipice. The journalists in the back row began typing furiously, the name Elena Vance rippling through the room like an electric current. She wasn't just Maya's mother. She was the woman who had spent a career staring down the most powerful corporations in the world and winning. She was a legend who had vanished into the shadows, and now she was back. "I am the law in this room today, Julian," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried better than a shout. She turned her head slightly to fix him with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. "You spent years telling my daughter that I was a failure, a woman who couldn't even protect herself. You used my absence to build a wall of lies around her, convincing her she was as alone as she was broken. But I wasn't hiding from you. I was hunting you." She turned back to the bench, her posture radiating an immovable authority that made the Billionaire's 12-man legal team look like children playing in the sand. "Your Honor, I am here not only to represent my daughter in these divorce proceedings but to serve as a key witness in a multi-agency federal investigation. Mr. Sterling's fortune isn't built on visionary tech. It's built on the systematic stripping of his wife's intellectual property and the laundering of those profits through the very offshore networks I've been tracking for the government." Julian's lawyer tried to object, but the word died in his throat as Elena fixed him with a look of such clinical disdain that he actually recoiled. She walked over to Maya, placing a firm, steady hand on her daughter's shoulder. For the first time in 2 years, Maya felt a sense of safety that didn't come from a pill or a locked room. She looked up at her mother, the woman the world feared and Julian had tried to dismiss as a lowlife, and realized the billionaire's trap hadn't just been sprung, it had been dismantled. "I am here," Elena repeated, her voice a shield of iron. "And the law is finally on the right side of this table? Your Honor, if we are to discuss accidents and liabilities, let us look at the source code of tragedy," Elena declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the stunned gallery. She didn't wait for the judge's nod. She tapped a command on her tablet, and the giant screens that had once mocked Maya's physical struggles flickered and died. When they roared back to life, they were no longer showing blurry surveillance footage. They were filled with the stark, cold blue of raw telematics data. "This," Elena said, pointing to a scrolling log of timestamps, "is the digital footprint of the night my daughter's spine was shattered." Julian Sterling has built his reputation on connectivity, on a world where every device is an extension of his will. That night, he extended his will to Maya's vehicle. The courtroom held its breath as a highlighted line of code pulsed in red. Elena's voice became a surgical instrument, precise and lethal. At 11:42 p.m., while Maya was navigating a rain-slicked curve on the West Side Highway, a remote, over-the-air update command was initiated. It didn't come from a Tesla service center. It originated from a secure, encrypted server located in the basement of Sterling Tech's headquarters, a server only one person has the biometric key for. The command, Elena continued, stepping closer to Julian, whose face was now the color of curdled milk, was a break override system disable. It was a kill command, Julian. You didn't just wait for an accident to happen so you could steal her company, you manufactured it. You watched the GPS in real time. You waited until she reached top speed, and then, with a single keystroke, you turned her car into a 2-ton coffin. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The judge leaned so far forward he was nearly out of his chair, his eyes fixed on the evidence that turned a civil divorce into a criminal attempted murder investigation. Maya stared at the screen, the horror of that night finally making sense. It wasn't a patch of ice. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a calculated strike by the man who had spent the last 2 years telling her she was lucky he stayed. Julian looked at the screen, then at his lawyers, but Thorne was already pulling his chair away, physically distancing himself from the digital bloodstains now visible to the entire world. The tech titan looked small, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a shroud. Elena leaned over his table, her shadow eclipsing him. "You didn't just break her car, Julian," she whispered, her voice a low, terrifying vibration. "You tried to break my daughter. And in my world, that is the only sin that is truly unforgivable." The courtroom fell silent as Elena Vance approached the witness stand, her heels clicking against marble like a metronome counting down to judgment. She held a manila folder, thin, unremarkable, yet Julian's attorney suddenly looked like a man watching his own execution. "Dr. Marcus Holloway," Elena said, her voice slicing through the tension. "You've been Maya Sterling's primary neurologist for 23 months. Tell the court about her prognosis." Dr. Holloway shifted in his seat, expensive suit suddenly too tight. "Mrs. Sterling's spinal injury is severe. Permanent. The damage to her lumbar vertebrae." "Doctor." Elena's interruption was surgical. "Did you prescribe baclofen to Mrs. Sterling?" "Yes." "For muscle spasticity, it's standard." "At what dosage?" The pause. "Too long. 40 milligrams daily." Elena opened her folder with the care of someone revealing a loaded gun. The standard therapeutic dose for spinal injury patients is 10 to 20 milligrams. You prescribed quadruple the recommended amount. She placed a document on the judge's bench. "This is a toxicology report from an independent lab. Mrs. Sterling's blood showed baclofen levels consistent with intentional overdosing, causing iatrogenic weakness, cognitive fog, and, conveniently for Mr. Sterling, the appearance of incompetence. Maya's hands trembled on her wheelchair armrests. The fog, the exhaustion, the days she couldn't remember her daughter's teacher's name. It hadn't been her injury. It had been Julian's insurance policy. Dr. Holloway, Elena continued, circling him like a predator, how much did Julian Sterling pay you to keep his wife chemically dependent? I object. Julian's lead attorney shot up. Overruled. Judge Morrison's voice was granite. Answer the question, doctor. Holloway's face crumbled. 200,000. Quarterly. The courtroom erupted. Maya heard nothing but the roar of her own blood, the truth rewriting 2 years of self-doubt. Julian had stolen her body in the accident. Then he'd stolen her mind with pills disguised as healing. Elena wasn't finished. She called Dr. Sarah Chin, a renowned neurologist from Johns Hopkins, who testified that with proper medication and aggressive physical therapy, Maya's condition could improve significantly. She has motor function in her lower extremities, Dr. Chin stated firmly. She was never properly evaluated because Dr. Holloway's treatment plan was designed to suppress recovery, not support it. Maya looked across the aisle at Julian. His golden boy mask had finally cracked, revealing the monster underneath. He tried to erase her one pill at a time, turn her into a ghost haunting her own life. Elena placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, brief, grounding. Your Honor, my daughter was poisoned by the man who vowed to love her. He didn't just want her money. He wanted her erased. Judge Morrison removed his glasses, disgust plain on his weathered face. Mr. Sterling, you're not just a thief. You're a monster. Elena didn't pause to let the courtroom recover from the medical revelations. She moved like a woman who'd been preparing for this moment for decades, pulling another document from her leather briefcase with the precision of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. Your Honor, the court needs to understand that Mr. Sterling's crimes extend far beyond domestic abuse and attempted murder. She handed a thick binder to the bailiff. This is a forensic audit conducted by the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It documents a $2 billion tax evasion scheme spanning 7 years and 14 countries. Julian's face drained of color. His lead attorney, Marcus Brennan, the man who'd spent 3 hours that morning calling Maya a liability, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into the expensive carpeting. Mr. Sterling created a network of shell companies, Elena continued, projecting a diagram onto the courtroom screens. Here, Nexus Holdings in the Cayman Islands. Here, Sterling Ventures Zurich. Here, Tech Fund Singapore. Each one designed to funnel profits from Sterling Tech through a labyrinth of offshore accounts, avoiding U.S. taxation entirely. She clicked to the next slide. Bank statements. Hundreds of them. Millions flowing like water through accounts with names like Prometheus Capital and Atlas Holdings, names designed to sound legitimate while hiding theft on a massive scale. Project Eraser wasn't just about removing Maya from Julian's life, Elena said, her voice cutting through the shocked murmurs rippling through the gallery. It was about removing the one person who could expose his fraud. Maya Sterling has a master's degree in structural engineering and an MBA from Wharton. She built the financial infrastructure of Sterling Tech. She knew where the money went. Maya felt the pieces clicking into place. The late-night arguments about restructuring. Julian's rage when she'd questioned the Singapore accounts. The way he'd isolated her from the company's CFO 6 months before the accident. The car crash wasn't passion or rage, Your Honor, Elena stated flatly. It was a calculated assassination attempt. Maya was scheduled to present quarterly financials to the board 3 days after the accident. She discovered discrepancies, $200 million that had vanished into Julian's offshore empire. Elena placed a final document before Judge Morrison. This is a federal warrant for Mr. Sterling's arrest on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, money laundering, and racketeering. The FBI has been building this case for 18 months. My daughter's custody battle just accelerated their timeline. Julian stood abruptly, chair screeching against marble. This is insane. Elena, you can't. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Judge Morrison commanded, his voice like thunder. He'd gone from presiding over a divorce to witnessing the exposure of one of the largest white-collar crimes in recent New York history. 2 federal agents materialized at the courtroom doors, badges gleaming under fluorescent lights. Julian's empire wasn't just crumbling. It was being incinerated, brick by stolen brick. Judge Morrison sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, his weathered hands clasped before him as if in prayer. The courtroom held its breath. Maya could hear her own heartbeat, could feel her mother's presence beside her like a shield that had finally arrived after years of fighting alone. When the judge finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. In my 32 years on the bench, I have witnessed humanity at its worst. But Mr. Sterling, you represent something particularly vile, a predator who weaponized love, marriage, and the legal system itself to destroy the woman who built your empire. Julian sat frozen, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume on a man playing dress-up. The golden boy of Silicon Valley had become a cornered animal. This court finds that Julian Marcus Sterling orchestrated the attempted murder of his wife through vehicular sabotage. Judge Morrison continued, each word a hammer blow. That he conspired to chemically incapacitate her through medical fraud. That he embezzled and laundered $2 billion through international shell corporations. And that he attempted to use this court as an instrument of further abuse. The judge turned to Maya, and something softened in his granite expression. Mrs. Sterling, I cannot give you back the 2 years this man stole. I cannot heal your body with a gavel. But I can ensure he never profits from his crimes. He lifted his gavel, and the sound of its striking would echoed like a gunshot. All marital assets, including Sterling Tech and its subsidiaries, are hereby awarded to Maya Sterling in their entirety. Julian Sterling is stripped of all corporate positions, stock options, and financial holdings. His personal accounts are frozen pending restitution for tax evasion and fraud. Julian's attorney tried to stand, but his client grabbed his arm, shaking his head. Even Marcus Brennan knew when the war was lost. Furthermore, Judge Morrison said, nodding to the federal agents waiting by the doors, Mr. Sterling is remanded to FBI custody immediately. Bail is denied given the flight risk and severity of charges. The evidence suggests a man with 14 offshore accounts and no moral compass will not voluntarily face justice. The agents moved forward, handcuffs gleaming. Julian looked at Maya one final time, and she saw it, the moment he realized she had never been the broken one. He had been. Broken by greed, by arrogance, by the belief that money could erase consequences. Maya, he started, voice cracking. Don't, she said quietly, her first words in hours. You tried to kill me twice. Once on that highway. Once in this courtroom. You failed both times. The handcuffs clicked shut around Julian's wrists with a sound of finality. As agents led him toward the doors, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years. Freedom. Not from the wheelchair, but from the prison Julian had built around her mind, brick by poisonous brick. The auditorium at the Javits Center hummed with anticipation, 3,000 people waiting to witness what tech journalists were calling the resurrection of Maya Sterling. Backstage, Maya adjusted her grip on the carbon fiber cane, feeling the familiar weight that had become an extension of herself, not a symbol of weakness, but a testament to survival. Nervous? Elena asked, standing beside her daughter in a navy suit that commanded respect without demanding attention. Maya smiled. Terrified. But the good kind. 12 months had passed since Julian's conviction. 12 months of intensive physical therapy that had restored partial mobility to her legs. 12 months of rebuilding Sterling Tech into something that actually reflected her vision, not his greed. She'd renamed it Foundation Technologies, a company dedicated to accessibility innovation and ethical AI development. The paralysis hadn't vanished. Maya would never run again, would always need assistance for longer distances. But Dr. Chin had been right. Julian's poisonous cocktail had suppressed recovery that was possible. Each step Maya took now, however halting, was a middle finger to the man currently serving 23 years in federal prison. Ladies and gentlemen, the moderator's voice boomed through the speakers. Please welcome the founder and CEO of Foundation Technologies, Maya Sterling. The applause hit her like a physical force as she walked onto the stage, cane in her right hand, her mother's arm lightly supporting her left. Not hiding. Not ashamed. Walking. The crowd rose to their feet, venture capitalists who'd once written her off, journalists who'd called her marriage a tragedy, competitors who'd assumed she'd disappear into obscurity. They were all standing now, watching a black woman in a custom blazer and adaptive leg braces claim the space that had always been hers. Maya reached the podium, her daughter Zara sitting front row, 9 years old and beaming with pride. Everything Julian had tried to steal, her child, her company, her dignity, sat before her, reclaimed. "Thank you," Maya said, voice steady, amplified across the vast space. "A year ago, I sat in a courtroom while someone tried to convince the world that my disability made me worthless. That my body's limitations diminished my mind's capabilities. That I was, in his words, a broken liability." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. Today, Foundation Technologies is valued at $3 billion. We've launched adaptive interfaces that give paralyzed users full control of their digital lives. We've created employment pipelines for disabled engineers who've been systematically excluded from Silicon Valley. And we've proven that the only thing broken was the system that tried to erase me. Elena squeezed her daughter's shoulder gently before stepping back, her job complete. Maya looked out at the sea of faces, some inspired, some uncomfortable, all listening. "I didn't survive Julian Sterling to be inspirational," she said. "I survived to build something better. And that's exactly what we're doing." The applause was thunder. Maya Sterling had walked back into her empire, one defiant step at a time. If this story of justice inspired you, don't let it end here. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss another reckoning where the truth finally comes to light. Share Maya's story with someone who needs to remember that they matter, that their strength is internal, and that being targeted doesn't mean being defeated. Sometimes, all it takes is one person's influence or family courage to dismantle an empire of lies. What will you stand for? Subscribe. See you in the next video.